What is up, YouTube? It's your girl Evelyn, and it is time to break out the subtitles because we are about to dive into the critically acclaimed, visually stunning period drama, Portrait of a Lady on Fire. As always, there will be spoilers, so proceed with caution. The film begins in a classroom in 18th century France. A young art teacher named Marianne is posing for her students when she notices one of her paintings has been put on display. The painting, entitled Portrait of a Lady on Fire, depicts a hauntingly beautiful woman surrounded by a desolate landscape with the bottom of her dress engulfed in flames. Marianne seems deeply affected by the painting and tells her curious students she painted it a long time ago. This admission leads to a Titanic-esque flashback, and we are whisked from the classroom to the sea. Marianne is now on a rowboat, clutching a wooden crate, and when the boat hits a particularly rough wave, the crate flies overboard. The super awesome and helpful rowers simply watch. Marianne dives into the freezing water and rescues her crate. Not long after, she is dropped off on the shores of a remote French island and sets out for her destination. It's late when she arrives, and only Sophie, the servant of the house, is awake to greet her. Marianne is shown to her room, where she immediately opens her crate and pulls out two blank but drenched canvases. After drying both herself and the canvases by the fire, Marianne slips downstairs for a midnight snack. Once again, Sophie pops up and serves Marianne not only a glass of wine, but the tea of the house as well. Apparently, Heloise, the mistress of the house, has only been home for 3 weeks. Prior to that, she lived in a convent. But when Heloise's older sister died unexpectedly, Heloise was forced to return and fulfill her sister's obligations. Obligations that include marrying a rich and probably old Italian dude. Sophie also hints that Heloise cannot be painted, finally making the reason for Marianne's presence on the island clear. She has been commissioned to paint an engagement portrait of Heloise. Back in her room, Marianne finds a mysterious discarded portrait. The next morning, we meet Heloise's mother, the Countess, and discover 3 important facts. 1. Marianne landed the portrait job through good old-fashioned nepotism. Her father is a successful painter and painted the Countess many years ago. 2. Heloise's impending marriage is dependent upon the completion and acceptance of the portrait. And 3. Heloise refused to sit for the last painter, therefore Marianne must paint Heloise without her knowledge. She will pretend to be Heloise's walk-in companion while studying her on the sly. Later, Marianne presses her girl Sophie for more tea, and Sophie explains that Heloise's sister fell from the cliffs. It's clear the Countess is afraid the same fate will befall Heloise and won't allow her daughter to leave the house unchaperoned. It's time for Marianne and Heloise's first walk, and Marianne barely makes it down the stairs before Heloise takes off. Marianne follows her and nearly has a heart attack when Heloise suddenly breaks into a run, heading straight for the edge of a cliff. At the last moment, she stops and turns around, giving Marianne her very first look at Heloise's face. They talk very little, but Marianne manages to steal peeks at Heloise, trying to commit her face to memory so that she might paint it in secret later. Heloise also stares at Marianne, likely because Marianne is staring at her, which is, kind of weird. That evening, Marianne sketches Heloise's face, and the next day, she begins the portrait. It's a windy day, and both ladies have their mouth and noses covered because, well, I guess that's what you did in 18th century France when it was windy. There's even more staring this time around, along with a bit of conversation. Heloise asks Marianne how long she'll be staying, and Marianne tells her 6 days. Marianne also manages to draw a quick sketch of Heloise's hands. Later that evening, Marianne and Sophie are hanging out in the kitchen, when Marianne admits that she's struggling. How can she create a smiling portrait of Heloise when the woman never smiles? Sophie asks Marianne if she's tried being funny. Marianne has become tired of the polite niceties and goes from 0 to 100 real quick. She outright asks Heloise if she thinks her sister killed herself. Impressed by Marianne's directness, Heloise reveals that her sister left her a note, apologizing for forcing Heloise into the arranged marriage meant for her. Marianne, perhaps feeling guilty about the freedom she takes for granted, asks the Countess to loosen Heloise's reins a bit and allow her to leave the house without supervision. In Marianne's opinion, Heloise isn't sad, just angry. The Countess says she'll consider it. Marianne is making excellent progress on the portrait when Heloise pops in unexpectedly. Marianne quickly conceals her activities as Heloise strolls in and announces that the Countess has allowed her to attend Mass alone. Heloise is most looking forward to the music, which leads Marianne to play a section of Vivaldi's Four Seasons on a forgotten harpsichord pushed against the wall. Marianne plays the Presto from Summer, a piece about a beautiful day interrupted by an impending storm. Heloise is tickled and cannot keep her eyes off of Marianne while she plays. Heloise is back from Mass, and while Marianne hides a paint-covered hand behind her back, the flushed Heloise tells her all about the moving experience. She then asks Marianne about her departure date. Marianne is scheduled to leave tomorrow, and Heloise quietly admits the emotion she felt most poignantly was that of missing Marianne. Marianne has finished the portrait, and after telling the giddy Countess, she insists upon telling Heloise the truth and showing her the painting first. In a fit of rage, or perhaps guilt, Marianne destroys the portrait of Heloise, painted by the no-name artist before her. The next day, she and Heloise are on their final walk. Marianne comes clean and admits that the Countess hired her to paint Heloise on the down low. Heloise shows little outward reaction, but decides to take a bath in the ice-cold sea. After her dip, she comes back blue-lipped and shivering, remarking that Marianne's constant stares now make sense. Back at the manor, Marianne unveils the portrait, and Heloise is like, "Is that supposed to be me?" Marianne is like, "Obviously." Heloise is offended by the portrait, demanding to know if that's how Marianne sees her. Marianne gives her a bullshit reply, which leads to Heloise calling the portrait trash without actually calling it trash. And Marianne reaches her breaking point, telling Heloise, "I didn't know you were an art critic." To which Heloise replies, "I didn't know you were a painter." Marianne's portrait doesn't capture Heloise any more than the defaced portrait did. In her exasperation, Marianne defaces her portrait in the exact same way. She tells the disappointed Countess it wasn't good enough, vowing to paint another one. The Countess isn't in the mood for excuses and is about to send Marianne packing when Heloise steps in. She tells her mother she will pose for Marianne, and the Countess nearly does a backflip. She then tells them she's leaving on a 5-day trip to Italy, and when she returns, she expects a finished portrait. Things are still a bit tense as Heloise sits for the painting. Marianne begins the portrait, and no longer relegated to stealing glances, she stares openly at her subject as she paints, and her subject stares right back. Later that evening, Marianne discovers that Aunt Flo has paid her a visit, and the helpful Sophie makes her an 18th century heating pad. Sophie then tells Marianne she hasn't received a visit from Aunt Flo in quite some time. The next day, Marianne and Heloise are standing several yards apart on the beach while Sophie sprints between them, eventually collapsing in exhaustion. We then see the trio search through some foliage for a specific plant used to make 18th century Plan B, and while Heloise looks for the plant, Marianne looks at her. It's evening and Marianne is cooking up the liquid Plan B while Sophie is literally hanging from the rafters. Sophie jumps down, takes it to the head, then goes right back up. While waiting for the LPB to take effect, Heloise asks Marianne if she's ever had Sophie's particular issue. Marianne says she has, and Heloise then asks her about sex. But before Marianne can reply, Sophie falls to the floor. After putting Sophie to bed, Heloise falls asleep beside her, and Marianne quietly pulls out her sketchbook and begins drawing. Heloise awakens, but instead of getting up, she poses for Marianne with a smile on her face. Marianne is painting the now unsmiling Heloise, and can feel the anger radiating off her subject in waves. It seems Heloise has not fully forgiven Marianne for lying to her. Marianne apologizes, explaining she never intended to hurt Heloise. And although Heloise won't admit to being hurt, her feelings are clearly written on her face. A face Marianne has been closely studying from the moment they met. Marianne tells Heloise she cannot hide her feelings from someone who sees all of her. Heloise then points out that while Marianne has been studying her, she too has been studying Marianne. After the day's emotional session, Marianne and Heloise join Sophie for a game of cards, and the tension between them melts away as they laugh together while continuing to gaze openly at one another. Heloise is posing with a scarf around her throat. Marianne asks her to lower it, and she does. Marianne then asks her to lower it again, and Heloise rips it off entirely, wondering aloud if Marianne is thinking of her future husband's gaze. This leads to a conversation about painting nude models and ends in Marianne stealthily complimenting Heloise's beauty. It's evening and Heloise is reading the tragic Greek tale of Eurydice and Orpheus. Eurydice and Orpheus have been married for less than 24 hours when poor Eurydice is bitten by a snake and tragically dies. Orpheus risks his own life to travel to the underworld and bring her back. Hades, the god of the underworld, tells Orpheus that Eurydice can leave on one condition. She must follow Orpheus as he walks out of the underworld. But if he turns around to look at her before reaching the light, Eurydice will be pulled back and remain in the underworld forever. Orpheus begins walking, but moments before he reaches the light, he turns around, and as foretold, Eurydice is snatched from him forever. The tale leads to a lively debate. Sophie believes Orpheus was an idiot who obviously didn't love Eurydice, otherwise he wouldn't have turned around. Marianne believes Orpheus turned around because he only wanted the memory of Eurydice, not the woman herself. Heloise suggests that perhaps it was Eurydice who asked Orpheus to turn around at the last moment. The girls then decide to hit up Club Brittany. Just kidding. They actually seek out the local herbalist at a bonfire gathering to find out if their homemade LPB worked. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But while Sophie visits with the herbalist, Marianne stares at Heloise through the flames of the bonfire. And when the tail end of Heloise's dress catches on fire, we finally see Marianne's portrait of a lady on fire in real life. The next day, during their seaside walk, Marianne can hold back no longer and kisses Heloise, who kisses her back, then immediately runs away. It's dinner time and Heloise is nowhere to be found. Marianne heads to her room, but on the way she briefly glimpses an ephemeral vision of Heloise wearing a wedding dress. Back in her room, Marianne finds the real Heloise waiting for her. The two embrace and kiss as their love scene fades to black. It's the morning after and the new lovers are awakened by a knock at the door. It's Sophie, and she wants to know if they will accompany her to see the herbalist. They agree, and several moony looks later, find themselves witnessing Sophie's abortion, and although Marianne tries to look away, Heloise won't let her. It's evening time and Heloise is far from tired. She suggests they have a painting party to capture the day's events. Heloise, playing the role of the herbalist, poses with Sophie while Marianne sketches them. Marianne is working on the portrait, but Heloise cannot stop smiling at her, and their painting session quickly turns into a session of another kind. Later, after ingesting a little homegrown, Marianne once again sees Heloise's spectral figure floating in the hallway wearing a wedding dress. The portrait is nearly complete, and this time, Heloise likes it. But unfortunately, the reality of Heloise's upcoming nuptials spoils the moment, and the two have a spat. After their fight, Marianne is told by Sophie that the Countess will return tomorrow, and she rushes to the beach in search of Heloise. Marianne embraces her and begs forgiveness. Back at the manor, after a little makeup sex, Marianne is sketching herself a portrait of Heloise to remember her by. Heloise asks for a portrait of Marianne as well, and the artist sketches herself on page 28 of Heloise's book, the same book that holds the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. That night, as they lay in bed together, their gazes are open and intense as they try to commit each other to memory. It's the next morning and the Countess has returned with a courier for the portrait. She's as pleased as Punch with the end result and pays Marianne as the courier whisks the painting away. After saying goodbye to Sophie, Marianne is surprised to see Heloise trying on the wedding dress her mother brought back from Milan. Marianne gives Heloise an intense but super quick hug and rushes away. As she opens the manor door for the final time, Heloise calls out to her, "Turn around." She does, and the image of Heloise standing at the top of the stairs is the last image we see. We are back in art class, and Marianne is looking over the sketches her students made of her. She complains about how sad they made her look, and a student replies, "You were sad." We then get a voiceover epilogue from Marianne, telling us she saw Heloise only twice more. The first was in the form of a portrait. We see Marianne at an art gallery where she's showing her latest work, a portrait of Orpheus and Eurydice at the moment Orpheus turns around. As Marianne makes her way through the gallery, she stops and stares at a portrait of Heloise sitting beside a small child. It is a lovely, if not lifeless portrait, but what catches Marianne's eye is the book on Heloise's lap with her finger resting on page 28. The second and final time Marianne saw Heloise was at a concert, and although Marianne sat in a gallery across from her, Heloise did not see her. The orchestra begins to play the same section of Vivaldi's The Four Seasons that Marianne had played for Heloise on the harpsichord, and as the music crests, we watch in heart-shattering awe as a myriad of emotions dance across Heloise's face, until the stunning end of the piece and the equally stunning film. And that is it for the recap. Thank you guys so much for watching, and for more recaps like this, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next week.